He spent 50 years playing the most trusted lawman in American television history. For an entire generation, the name Andy Griffith meant Mayberry, a fictional town where every problem got solved by supper time and the worst crime on the books was a runaway pig. Millions of people felt like they knew him personally. So when word broke on the morning of July 3, 2012, that Andy Griffith had died at the age of 86, the country braced for the kind of send-off reserved for American icons. A public viewing. A procession through his home state of North Carolina. Maybe a state funeral, or at least a memorial service broadcast on every network that had ever aired a rerun of his show. None of that happened. By the time most Americans turned on their televisions and saw the headline, Andy Griffith was already in the ground. He had been buried on his own property before lunchtime, a little over 4 hours after he drew his last breath. There was no viewing, no procession, no public service of any kind. And for years afterward, that timeline fueled speculation, gossip, and outright conspiracy theories about what the family might have been hiding. The real answer isn't a scandal. It's something far more human, a story about privacy, faith, loyalty, and a small coastal community that closed ranks around a man they considered one of their own. Let's go through exactly what happened, hour by hour, and why. By the summer of 2012, Andy Griffith had spent decades of his later life away from Hollywood, living on Roanoke Island, part of North Carolina's Outer Banks. It's a quiet, historically rich stretch of coastline, the same ground where the Lost Colony vanished in the 1580s, and it had been Griffith's home base since the 1940s, long before he was famous. Friends who knew him there didn't see a celebrity. They saw a neighbor. On the evening of July 2nd, Griffith fell seriously ill at his home in Manteo. According to reporting at the time from CNN and North Carolina's WITN-TV, emergency crews were called to the house, though no formal cause of death was released publicly in the first hours afterward. Griffith was 86 years old, and by several later accounts, including a description that circulated in entertainment coverage of his death, he had been dealing with underlying cardiac issues, including high blood pressure and coronary artery disease, for a number of years. He did not go to a hospital. He stayed home, surrounded by the people closest to him. His wife of nearly 30 years, Cindy Knight Griffith, a former actress and singer he had met while doing summer theater in the early 1980s, was at his side. In a statement released the day he died, Cindy described her husband simply, "He is the love of my life, my constant companion, my partner, and my best friend." She added that she took comfort in her faith, saying she trusted that Andy was at peace and with God. In the early morning hours of July 3rd, at around 7 a.m. Eastern Time, Andy Griffith died at home on Roanoke Island. Here's where the story becomes genuinely strange, at least on its surface. By approximately 11:30 that same morning, less than 5 hours after his death, Griffith's body had already been lowered into a grave on his own property. This wasn't leaked or discovered later. It was confirmed on the record, the same day, by a representative from Twyford Funeral Homes, the local funeral home handling the arrangements, who spoke to both CNN and TMZ. The spokesperson, who declined to be named, citing the sensitivity of the matter, told CNN plainly, "It had been planned for some time. This was the wish of his family." A statement released by the Griffith family that day said only that he had been laid to rest on his beloved farm on Roanoke Island. That was it. No details on the cause of death beyond an illness. No location beyond the island. No invitation for the public, or even for extended friends and colleagues, to say goodbye. For most Americans, the news of Andy Griffith's death and the news that he had already been buried arrived in the same breath. There was no gap between "he has passed away" and "he has already been laid to rest." That collapsed timeline is what set off alarm bells for so many people. When something moves that fast, especially involving someone that famous, the instinct is to assume there's something being covered up. So let's address that directly, because it matters. North Carolina is one of a number of states that allows home burial on private property, and it does not require embalming, a funeral home service, or a mandatory waiting period before burial, provided a death certificate is properly filed and local health and zoning requirements are met. Griffith had the land, he had the legal right, and his family exercised that right. The speed was unusual. It was not, in any legal sense, improper. What made it newsworthy wasn't legality, it was precedent. Larry F. Stiegel, who at the time was executive director of the North Carolina Funeral Directors Association and had worked in the funeral industry for over 3 decades, told CNN he couldn't recall ever encountering a burial handled that quickly. "It's not very common," he said, noting that traditional funeral customs typically build in several days between death and burial specifically so that family and friends scattered across the country have time to travel and pay their respects. Stiegel was careful to add, though, that whatever the family requests, funeral homes are obligated to honor it. The family's wishes are always abided by. That distinction, unusual but not improper and absolutely intentional, is the key to understanding everything that followed. The full explanation for the rushed burial didn't come from a press conference in 2012. It came 3 years later, in 2015, when journalist Daniel DeVice published Andy and Dawn, The Making of a Friendship and a Classic American TV Show, a dual biography of Griffith and his longtime co-star and friend Don Knotts. DeVice had a personal connection to the material. He was Knotts' brother-in-law by marriage, and for the book he conducted extensive interviews with surviving cast members, family, and people who knew both men best. According to DeVice's reporting, the plan to bury Griffith immediately wasn't a last-minute panic decision made by a grieving widow. It was something Griffith himself had set in motion in advance, while he was still alive and thinking clearly, by confiding in a small circle of trusted friends. DeVice wrote that Griffith wanted to be buried immediately after death specifically so that it would happen before the paparazzi could storm Roanoke Island to capture his remains on film. Think about what that tells you about the man. After more than 50 years in the public eye, a Broadway run in the 1950s, a career-defining sitcom in the 60s, decades more as the folksy defense attorney on Matlock, Griffith had watched, again and again, what happens when a famous person dies. Helicopters circling private homes. Photographers scaling fences for a single shot. Grieving families forced to mourn in public, with cameras documenting every tear. He didn't want that ending. Not for himself, and not for the people who loved him. So he made a choice most celebrities never get the chance to make. He controlled the story of his own death before it happened. What happened next is the detail that gets left out of most retellings, and it's arguably the most remarkable part of the entire story. Executing Griffith's plan required more than a grieving family quietly following instructions. It required an entire community to actively protect him in his final hours, and according to DeVice's account in Andy and Dawn, that's exactly what Dare County did. DeVice wrote that the ever-loyal denizens of Dare County did their part. The sheriff grounded helicopters to keep camera crews away from the Griffith estate. There's something almost too fitting about that detail. Andy Griffith spent nearly a decade of his career playing Sheriff Andy Taylor, the calm, unflappable lawman of a fictional town that had come to symbolize small-town American decency itself. And in the final hours of his real life, an actual sheriff in an actual small town used real authority to shield him from exactly the kind of media circus that Mayberry never had to deal with. The fiction and the reality lined up in a way you couldn't script. The community held the line. The cameras never got their shot. Word of Griffith's death and burial reached the outside world only after both had already happened, a media outcome that would have been nearly impossible to engineer for anyone less locally beloved, or in a town less willing to protect one of its own. But according to DeVice, that same speed came with a cost. He wrote that the hectic timetable meant that only a few of Andy's local friends could attend the makeshift service. The plan worked exactly as designed. It also meant almost no one outside that small circle got the chance to say a proper goodbye. That cost fell hardest on Griffith's own family, specifically on his only surviving child. Andy Griffith had 2 children from his first marriage to Barbara Bray Edwards, both of them adopted, a son, Andy Samuel Griffith Jr., known as Sam, and a daughter, Dixie Nan Griffith. Sam struggled for years with alcoholism and died in 1996 at just 36 years old, a loss that friends say Griffith carried with him for the rest of his life. That left Dixie as his only living child by the time he died in 2012. Dixie was not present for her father's burial. The window between his death and his interment, roughly 4.5 hours, simply didn't leave enough time for her to travel to Roanoke Island, even setting out the moment she learned what had happened. His only surviving child could not stand at the graveside. According to Device's reporting, Dixie later said that although she would have liked the chance to pay her respects in person, she understood exactly why her father had arranged things the way he did. That's a distinctly bittersweet kind of grief, fully understanding the reasoning behind a decision, and still carrying the weight of having missed the moment itself. Some accounts of Griffith's final days also describe a last phone call between father and daughter shortly before he died, in which he asked whether she had found peace in her own life and spoke to her about the calm he himself had found, a conversation Dixie later said she somehow knew, in the moment, would be their last. It's worth sitting with that for a second. In trying to shield his death from a media circus, Griffith created a burial so fast and so quiet that even his own child was shut out of it. The plan protected him from the cameras. It also meant some of the people who loved him most never got their moment of farewell. The rushed burial wasn't the last controversy to touch Andy Griffith's legacy. About 8 months later, in March 2013, his widow Cindy Griffith obtained a demolition permit from Dare County for a smaller house on the Roanoke Sound, not the larger home she and Andy had built together in his later years, but the older property he had purchased back in the 1950s, where he raised his 2 children. According to reporting from the Associated Press at the time, that older house carried real sentimental weight for people who had known Griffith for decades. Tony Award-winning costume designer William Ivy Long, whose family had been close with Griffith and his first wife, told reporters that Griffith had confided to him back in 2007 that he hoped the house could eventually be preserved as a museum, filled with memorabilia from his television and music career. Ira David Wood III, a longtime friend from Griffith's years performing in the outdoor drama The Lost Colony, said he'd always assumed the property would eventually be preserved for the public, comparing it to Elvis Presley's Graceland. "I always assumed the property would be eventually preserved and open to the public," Wood told the Washington Times, adding that he hoped the family wasn't moving too fast. The house was demolished anyway. Reporting at the time noted that Griffith's will, signed just 2 months before his death, transferred most of his estate into a private trust and made no specific mention of the house or a museum, leaving Cindy with full legal authority over the property. Della Bassnight, a longtime family friend from Manteo, put the tension diplomatically, telling reporters she understood Cindy had every right to do what she wanted with her own property, but added, "When he gave her the power to do anything, I don't think he thought she would want to do that." It's important to separate the two decisions here. The rapid burial is well documented, through Device's reporting, as something Griffith himself planned and requested. The demolition of the house appears to have been Cindy's decision alone, made after his death, and it drew real pushback from people in Griffith's circle who felt his stated wishes about the property weren't honored. Family situations after a death are almost always messier than outsiders ever get to see, and reasonable people who loved Griffith clearly landed on different sides of that particular decision. Underneath all of it, the speed, the secrecy, the small-town cooperation, was something simpler than a conspiracy: Andy Griffith's faith. Griffith grew up singing gospel hymns as a boy at Grace Moravian Church in Mount Airy, North Carolina, the small town widely understood to be the real-life inspiration for Mayberry. That music stayed with him his entire life. In 1997, he won a Grammy Award for Best Southern, Country, or Bluegrass Gospel Album for I Love to Tell the Story, 25 timeless hymns, a record of the same hymns he'd sung as a child. He was later inducted into the Christian Music Hall of Fame and Museum. In her statement on the day he died, Cindy Griffith didn't frame his death as a tragedy to be managed. She described her husband as a person of incredibly strong Christian faith, who was prepared for the day he would be called home to his Lord. That framing matters. For a man who saw death not as an ending to be delayed but as something closer to a homecoming, an elaborate public funeral wasn't a comfort he was chasing. Quiet and quick, surrounded by the handful of people who mattered most, was the ending he actually wanted. By the time Griffith died, he had already lost most of the people who had defined the earlier chapters of his life. Don Knotts, his closest friend and the actor behind Deputy Barney Fife, had died in 2006, Griffith visited him in his final days, a friendship that had outlasted the show itself by 4 decades. His son Sam had died in 1996. At 86 years old, having said goodbye to his closest people the night before, Griffith's death wasn't a mystery to be solved. It was, by every available account, a death he had already made peace with. Andy Griffith remains buried on private property on Roanoke Island to this day. There is no headstone open to the public, no marked grave for fans to visit, no address anyone outside the family has ever confirmed. In an era where the resting places of nearly every public figure are documented, mapped, and turned into destinations, Griffith's grave has stayed exactly what he wanted it to be: private. If you want to feel connected to his legacy, the place to go isn't Roanoke Island, it's Mount Airy, the small North Carolina town that inspired Mayberry and has fully embraced that connection. The Andy Griffith Museum there holds the largest collection of memorabilia from his career, spanning his years in theater, music, film, and television. Visitors can tour the town in a replica of Deputy Barney Fife's squad car, see the modest house where Griffith grew up before fame ever found him, and attend the annual Mayberry Days festival, which draws tens of thousands of fans back to something close to the town Griffith made famous. At the center of Mount Airy stands a bronze statue of Sheriff Andy Taylor and his son Opie walking to a fishing hole, poles slung over their shoulders, the image from the show's opening credits, frozen in bronze. Griffith attended its unveiling in 2003 and reportedly looked it over and said simply, "That beats anything. That statue is where the public keeps him." The sheriff, the patient father, the voice of an idealized small-town America that never quite existed but that people wanted to believe in anyway. The real man, private, deliberate, and at peace, is somewhere quiet on an island he loved, in a spot known only to the handful of people who were there. Andy Griffith spent 50 years belonging to everyone. In the way he chose to leave, he finally belonged only to himself.